The sun was blazing in the cloudless sky as the young guardsman stood perfectly still outside the famous military museum. His black shoes gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the summer heat that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Even with sweat threatening to roll down his forehead, his posture remained as straight as an arrow, a testament to years of dedicated service. The museum had always been a popular spot, but today was exceptionally busy. Tour buses kept pulling up one after another, releasing waves of excited visitors from all corners of the world. Some carried guidebooks, others clutched water bottles, but almost everyone had their phones out, ready to capture memories of their visit. The guardsman had been standing at his post for nearly 4 hours now, but you wouldn't know it by looking at him. His ceremonial uniform, pressed to perfection, didn't show a single wrinkle despite the heat. The brass buttons on his jacket caught the sunlight, creating tiny sparkles that caught the eyes of passing children who would stop and stare in wonder. A group of school kids on a field trip gathered nearby, their excited whispers carrying across the plaza. "Look how still he is," one child gasped. "Is he even breathing?" Another wondered out loud. Their teacher used this moment to share a brief history lesson about the honor and discipline required to be a ceremonial guard. The guardsman's chest swelled with pride, though his expression remained unchanged. He'd been doing this job for 6 years now, and every day brought something new. Sometimes it was the questions visitors would ask the tour guides about his role. Other times, it was the veterans who would stop and salute, understanding the dedication it took to stand guard in any weather. Today, he watched through his peripheral vision as an elderly woman explained to her grandson how the guards represented something bigger than themselves. They were living symbols of duty and respect. The morning crowd started to grow thicker as more tourists arrived for the museum's popular midday tours. The air filled with different languages: French, German, Japanese, Spanish, all mixing together in a cheerful buzz of excitement. Every few minutes, someone would try to take a selfie with him, carefully positioning themselves to get the perfect shot without disturbing his space. Through it all, the guardsman remained motionless, his eyes focused straight ahead. But he wasn't just standing there, he was observing everything. He noticed the young couple sharing their first vacation together, the grandmother holding her granddaughter's hand as they walked up the museum steps, and the amateur photographer trying to capture the perfect angle of the building's historic facade. The guardsman thought about his own family as he stood there. His little one had visited him at work just yesterday, proudly pointing out, "That's my dad," to anyone who would listen. These moments made every second of standing in the heat worth it. He was setting an example not just for his child, but for every young person who passed by and saw someone dedicated to their duty. A light breeze finally offered some relief from the heat, carrying with it the distant sound of a military band practicing for an upcoming ceremony. The familiar music brought back memories of his first day on the job, when everything felt new and slightly overwhelming. Now, after thousands of hours at his post, the position felt as natural as breathing. The morning continued to unfold around him. Tours starting and ending, visitors coming and going, cameras clicking, children laughing. Each moment was part of the familiar rhythm of his day. But something about this particular morning felt different. Maybe it was the unusually large crowds, or perhaps it was the slightly tense energy he could feel building in the air. Whatever it was, his years of training had taught him to stay alert while maintaining his ceremonial pose. Little did he know that this ordinary summer morning was about to become anything but ordinary, and his unwavering dedication would soon be put to the ultimate test. As the morning shifted into early afternoon, the museum's entrance line grew longer, snaking around the building like a human chain. The guardsman noticed a particular visitor who stood out from the cheerful crowd, a middle-aged man in an expensive-looking polo shirt and designer sunglasses, constantly checking his watch and sighing loudly enough for everyone to hear. At first, the man just tapped his foot impatiently, but his frustration became more obvious with each passing minute. The summer heat wasn't helping. Sweat stained his collar, and his face grew increasingly red, though not just from the sun. He kept looking around as if searching for someone to blame for his inconvenience. "This is ridiculous," the man suddenly announced to nobody in particular, his voice carrying across the plaza. Several tourists turned to look, some with sympathy for the long wait, others clearly uncomfortable with his outburst. A few people in line tried to explain that the wait was normal for peak tourist season, but this only seemed to agitate him more. The guardsman remained perfectly still, yet his trained eye kept track of the situation. He'd seen this kind of behavior before. Tourists who let the heat and waiting get the better of them. Usually, they just needed a moment to cool down, both literally and figuratively. But something about this man's energy felt different, more volatile. A young family standing near the man shifted away slightly, the parents instinctively moving their children behind them. The father tried to distract his kids by pointing out the guardsman's impressive uniform, but the angry tourist's voice kept getting louder, making it hard to ignore. "I paid good money to be here," the man continued, his words becoming more slurred and hostile. The smell of alcohol began to make sense of his increasing aggression. He'd clearly started his tourism activities early in the day, and not at the museum gift shop. Other visitors started exchanging worried glances. An elderly couple who had been enjoying their guidebook quietly stepped out of line, deciding perhaps to return another day. The museum's regular security guard at the entrance door spoke quietly into his radio, aware that the situation might need attention. The angry tourist began pacing back and forth, his designer shoes scuffing against the pavement. His complaints evolved from the wait time to the temperature, then to the price of tickets, and finally to increasingly personal observations about the other tourists and staff. His words grew more offensive with each passing moment. A group of teenagers who had been happily taking selfies put their phones away and huddled closer together, their earlier joy replaced by obvious discomfort. One of them, trying to lighten the mood, made a joke about how the guardsman was handling the heat better than anyone else. This caught the angry man's attention. The tourist's gaze fixed on the guardsman, who continued to stand motionless at his post. Something about the guard's disciplined stance seemed to irritate the man even more. "Oh, so do you think you're better than everyone else?" he sneered, taking a step in the guardsman's direction. The crowd grew quiet. The only sounds were the distant traffic, the hum of the museum's air conditioning units, and the scuff of the tourist's feet as he took another step forward. The guardsman remained perfectly still, but his mind was alert, reading the situation with years of trained experience. Several people had their phones out now, but not for tourist photos anymore. They could sense something was about to happen. The security guard by the door started moving closer, speaking more urgently into his radio. The angry tourist took another step forward, his face now twisted with an emotion that went beyond simple frustration or heat exhaustion. The air felt electric with tension. Everyone could see where this was heading, but nobody wanted to believe someone would actually disrupt the peace of this historic place. The guardsman stood firm, representing not just himself, but generations of service members who had maintained their posts with dignity no matter the circumstance. As the tourist opened his mouth again, his words became even more offensive, targeting not just the wait time or the heat anymore, but something much more personal and hateful. The crowd held its collective breath, watching as a perfect summer morning teetered on the edge of turning into something none of them had expected to witness. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet it was over in seconds. The angry tourist, his face now bright red with rage, suddenly lunged forward. The crowd gasped as he pushed both hands against the guardsman's chest, hard enough to make any normal person stumble backward. The sound of his polished shoes scraping against the pavement echoed across the now silent plaza. The guardsman's training kicked in instantly. Despite the forceful shove, he managed to maintain his balance with just the slightest shift of his back foot, so subtle that most people didn't even notice it. His eyes remained fixed forward, his expression unchanging, even as the tourist's coffee-scented breath came close enough to fog his brass buttons. Phones were raised everywhere now, their camera lenses capturing every moment. A young student who had been sketching the building dropped her art supplies, the pencils rolling across the ground unnoticed. The security guard was now running toward them, his radio crackling with urgent responses. The tourist, seemingly enraged by the guardsman's lack of reaction, started shouting words that made parents cover their children's ears. His accusations and insults grew more personal and hateful, targeting the guardsman's race with shocking viciousness. The crowd's shock turned to outrage, but they remained frozen, watching the scene unfold. A woman in the crowd, who had been excitedly telling her friend about her first visit to the city just moments ago, now had tears in her eyes. Next to her, a retired veteran stood with his fists clenched, his face a mix of anger and pride at the Guardsman's composure. The tourist's words were like poison in the summer air, but the Guardsman stood firm, a living statue of dignity. The tourist raised his hand again, but this time several people moved forward, ready to intervene. A tour guide stepped between some children and the scene, trying to shield them from what was happening. The morning sun continued to beat down, indifferent to the drama unfolding below it. From the museum entrance, 2 more security officers emerged at a run. The tourist noticed them coming and took a step back, but his hateful words didn't stop. If anything, they became more bitter, more personal. He seemed determined to get a reaction from the Guardsman, whose only movement was the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. The crowd had grown larger now, with people from inside the museum pressing against the windows to see what was happening. A street musician who had been playing nearby stopped mid-song, his guitar hanging forgotten at his side. The only sounds were the tourist's voice, the approaching footsteps of security, and the quiet whir of dozens of phone cameras recording. Time seemed to stand still in that moment. The Guardsman, though still motionless, was processing everything with laser focus. His training had prepared him for physical threats, but it was his character that kept him steady now. He thought of his family, his fellow service members, and every person who had ever stood at this post before him. The tourist made one final attempt to provoke a response, his words slurring together as he stepped forward again. But before he could make contact, the security team reached him. They moved with professional efficiency, quickly putting themselves between the tourist and the Guardsman. The crowd let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. As the security officers began to escort the belligerent man away, he continued to shout over his shoulder. But now his words were lost in the growing murmur of the crowd as people began to speak again, their voices a mix of shock, anger, and amazement at what they had just witnessed. Through it all, the Guardsman remained at his post, his posture perfect, his gaze unwavering. The only sign that anything had happened was a single bead of sweat that finally broke free and rolled down his temple. But even that couldn't diminish the powerful image he presented, a picture of unshakable dignity in the face of hatred. The moment that followed the tourist's removal was unlike anything the museum plaza had ever witnessed. The Guardsman's response, or rather, his lack of response, spoke volumes louder than any words could have. His only movement was a slow, deliberate blink, like a photographer capturing a perfect moment in time. That single blink would later be described by witnesses as one of the most powerful statements they'd ever seen. The morning sun continued its climb in the sky, casting the Guardsman's shadow long across the plaza. His polished shoes still gleamed, his uniform remained crisp, and his posture stayed as straight as ever. But now there was something different in the air around him, a kind of quiet energy that made everyone present feel like they were witnessing something extraordinary. A gentle breeze stirred the flags above the museum entrance, and someone in the crowd started to clap. The applause spread slowly at first, then built like a summer storm until it filled the entire plaza. Still, the Guardsman didn't move. His disciplined stance spoke of years of training, but this moment revealed something deeper, a strength of character that no training manual could teach. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders to see better, pointing and whispering about what real courage looks like. An elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes, remembering perhaps her own battles with prejudice from years past. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "I want to be that brave when I grow up." The phones that had recorded the ugly incident now captured something beautiful, a moment of pure human dignity. The sunlight caught the brass buttons on the Guardsman's uniform, making them shine like beacons. His face remained professionally neutral, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes that everyone could see. A group of students who had been on a field trip stood quietly, their earlier chatter replaced by thoughtful expressions. Their teacher seized the moment for an impromptu lesson about character that no textbook could match. "Sometimes," she said softly to her class, "the strongest response is no response at all." The crowd's makeup was as diverse as the city itself. Tourists from every corner of the world, locals on their lunch breaks, families on vacation, veterans who had served in different wars. Yet in this moment, they were united in their admiration for the Guardsman's composure. Many would later say they felt changed by what they witnessed. Time seemed to move differently now. The usual hustle of the tourist spot had been replaced by something more meaningful. People spoke in whispers if they spoke at all. Many just stood there, wanting to be part of this moment for as long as possible. The morning's ugliness had been transformed into an unexpected lesson in grace under pressure. A young artist who had been sketching the building quickly flipped to a new page, her pencil flying across the paper as she tried to capture the Guardsman's unwavering stance. Several professional photographers who normally focused on the historic building found themselves drawn to this new subject, understanding that they were documenting something special. Near the back of the crowd, a veteran in a wheelchair sat up straighter, adjusting his own posture to match the Guardsman's. His grandson noticed and straightened up too, both of them paying silent tribute to the display of military bearing they were witnessing. The old soldier's eyes shone with understanding of exactly what this kind of discipline cost. The sun climbing higher now cast different shadows across the plaza, but the Guardsman's shadow remained straight and true, like his principles. The morning's heat was building, yet he showed no sign of discomfort. His stillness had become more than just military discipline. It was a quiet declaration that hatred would not win today. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, many lingered, taking one last look at the Guardsman. They wanted to remember this moment, to tell others about it, to hold on to the feeling of witnessing something rare and valuable. Without moving a muscle or saying a word, the Guardsman had given everyone present a masterclass in dignity, strength, and the power of choosing how to respond to hatred. The next few minutes showed just how well-trained the museum's security team really was. They moved with quiet efficiency, like a well-rehearsed dance that nobody hoped they'd ever have to perform. Two officers gently but firmly guided the angry tourist toward the security office, while another spoke calmly to the gathering crowd, making sure everyone was okay. Other guardsmen appeared from their posts around the building, moving with practiced precision. They didn't rush. Their movements were deliberate and professional, just as they'd trained for countless hours. Without a word being spoken between them, they adjusted their positions to maintain security while allowing their fellow guardsman to keep his post undisturbed. The crowd watched in amazement as this seamless response unfolded. A young security trainee who had just started last week stood in awe, taking mental notes of how smoothly the veteran officers handled the situation. This wasn't just security work, this was artistry in motion, years of experience visible in every careful step. Inside the museum lobby, staff members quickly reorganized the line of waiting visitors, their voices gentle but assured as they helped everyone feel safe again. A kind-faced employee handed out bottles of water to those who had been standing closest to the incident, her simple gesture of care helping to ease the tension in the air. The tourist's angry voice could still be heard, but it grew fainter as the security team led him away. His words no longer had power here. They were overshadowed by the quiet strength and professionalism of everyone responding to his actions. Some of the children who had been frightened earlier began to relax, watching with interest as the security team worked. A group of off-duty police officers who had been touring the museum stepped forward to offer their help, but the security team had everything well in hand. One of the officers nodded in approval, commenting to his colleague about how this was exactly how a situation should be handled, with calm authority and minimum drama. The museum's head of security arrived on scene, his walk unhurried but purposeful. He checked first on the guardsman, not with words, but with a respectful nod that was returned with an almost imperceptible blink. Then he turned his attention to coordinating with local law enforcement who had just arrived, his quiet confidence helping to maintain the calm atmosphere. Nearby, a nervous tour guide had gathered her group into a tight circle, distracting them by sharing fascinating facts about the museum's architecture. Her voice was steady, her smile genuine, as she turned an uncomfortable moment into an opportunity to showcase the building's history. Several tourists in her group visibly relaxed, grateful for her professional handling of the situation. The summer breeze carried the sounds of approaching sirens, but they weren't blaring. Just a gentle warning tone that grew gradually closer. Two police cruisers pulled up quietly, their officers stepping out with practiced calm. They had been fully briefed by radio and knew this was a situation that required presence, not theatrics. Through it all, other guardsmen maintained their posts, their stillness a reminder that while one person's hatred had disrupted the morning, it hadn't shaken the foundation of what they stood for. Visitors began taking photos again, but now with a deeper appreciation for what these guards represented. The museum director emerged from her office, her face concerned but composed. She spoke briefly with each group: security, police, staff, and witnesses, her words few but well chosen. She made sure everyone knew that counseling would be available for any staff or visitors who needed to talk about what they'd witnessed. As the situation continued to be handled with quiet efficiency, the plaza began to return to its normal rhythm. The line of visitors started moving again, but there was a new feeling in the air. People spoke more softly, moved more considerately, and many paused to really look at the guardsmen as they passed, seeing them with new eyes and deeper respect. By sunset that same day, the video of the guardsman's response had already spread across the internet. People weren't sharing it for the conflict, they were sharing it for the power of dignity under pressure. The morning's events had sparked something unexpected: a nationwide conversation about grace in the face of hatred. In the days that followed, news crews started appearing outside the museum. They stood at a respectful distance, their cameras capturing the normal flow of the guard changes, trying to spot the guardsman who had become an overnight symbol of strength. But he didn't seek attention. He simply continued his duties as he always had, with quiet pride and unwavering dedication. The guardsman's fellow service members were interviewed by various news channels. "That's just who he is," said one of his colleagues, smiling warmly. "He doesn't just wear the uniform, he lives up to everything it stands for." Another added, "He's the same person whether cameras are rolling or not. That's what makes him special." Back at home, the guardsman's young child was watching cartoons when the news story came on. "Look, that's Dad," the little one exclaimed to anyone who would listen. The guardsman's response wasn't just about military training anymore, it was about showing his child how to face ugliness with beauty, hatred with dignity. Local schools began asking if they could bring students to the museum for special tours. Teachers saw this as a perfect opportunity to discuss important topics like respect, self-control, and standing up to hatred. One fourth-grade teacher later shared how her students had started playing Guardsman at recess, standing straight and tall, practicing what they called their brave face. The museum noticed something interesting in the weeks that followed. Visitors from all over the country started bringing thank you cards. The wall near the guard post slowly filled with colorful notes, many from children. "Thank you for being brave," one read in crayon. "You showed me that sometimes being strong means being quiet," said another in careful handwriting. Professional training organizations reached out to the museum, asking to use the security footage in their courses, not to show the tourists' behavior, but to demonstrate how professional responses could turn ugly situations into powerful teaching moments. Police academies, security firms, and customer service trainers all saw something valuable in those few minutes of footage. The guardsman himself was invited to speak at various events, but he mostly declined. When asked why by his commanding officer, he simply said, "The uniform speaks louder than any words I could say." He did, however, agree to meet with a group of young cadets who were just starting their training. He didn't give them a long speech. He just shared what was in his heart that morning. One day, a retired military officer visited the museum. He waited in line like everyone else, and when he reached the guardsman, he stood at attention and saluted. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. As he walked away, visitors overheard him tell his grandson, "That's what we mean when we talk about the power of self-control." Local community leaders began using the incident as an example in their talks about building bridges between different groups. They pointed out how one person's dignity had done more to fight hatred than any angry response could have. Youth groups started discussing what real strength looks like and how silence can sometimes be the most powerful statement. Social media picked up on something subtle in the video, the moment when the guardsman blinked. People started calling it the dignity blink, sharing it as a GIF, but not as a joke. It became a symbol for choosing peace over conflict, strength over reaction. "Hit them with the dignity blink" became a popular phrase for staying calm in tough situations. The incident changed how many people saw the museum guards. Visitors no longer just posed for quick photos with them, they'd really looked at them, seeing the dedication it took to stand there day after day. The tourists' hatred had tried to diminish someone's dignity, but instead, it had revealed just how unshakable true dignity could be. 6 months after the incident, the impact of that summer morning continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. The video had become more than just another viral moment. It had turned into a powerful teaching tool used across the country. Military academies showed it to new recruits, police departments included it in their training, and schools used it to discuss character and courage. The Guardsman's story found its way into training manuals and presentations, but it wasn't just the professional world that changed. Everyday people found inspiration in his example. Office workers dealing with angry customers would quietly straighten their posture and remember the dignity blink. Teachers facing difficult situations would think of his calm stance and find their own strength. One cold winter morning, a letter arrived at the museum. It was from a young boy in a small town hundreds of miles away. "Dear Sir," it began in careful handwriting, "I got bullied at school last week. I remembered your video and stood tall like you did. It worked. The bully tried to make me mad, but I just blinked slowly like you did. My teacher saw it and said I handled it perfectly. Thank you for teaching me how to be brave." The letter joined hundreds of others in a special display the museum had created. They called it the Strength Through Peace exhibition, featuring stories and messages from people whose lives had been touched by that moment. Visitors would often spend hours reading through them, many wiping away tears or nodding in understanding. The Guardsman's fellow service members noticed subtle changes in how people treated them. Visitors no longer saw them as just photo opportunities. There was a new respect in people's eyes. Young children would practice standing at attention nearby, their parents using the moment to talk about important values like respect, dignity, and courage. In police academies across the country, trainers developed what they called the Museum Guard Protocol, a method for keeping calm in hostile situations. If you can maintain your dignity like that Guardsman did, instructors would say, you've already won the situation. The phrase, "What would the museum guard do?" became a common saying among officers facing difficult moments. The tourists' hatred had tried to create a dark moment, but instead, it had sparked something bright. Community centers started hosting dignity workshops, teaching young people how to handle conflict with grace. One youth center painted a mural of the Guardsman on their wall with the words, "Strength stands quiet" underneath. A year after the incident, a documentary filmmaker wanted to tell the Guardsman's story. She was surprised when he suggested focusing not on him, but on the changes his actions had inspired in others. The resulting film featured stories from around the country: the 4th grade class that created a kindness guard program, the customer service team that kept a picture of the Guardsman in their break room for inspiration, the bullied kids who found strength in his example. The Guardsman himself remained unchanged by the attention, continuing his duties with the same dedication he'd always shown. But sometimes, on quiet mornings when young visitors would practice standing at attention near his post, a subtle smile would cross his face, gone so quickly you'd miss it if you blinked. One particularly meaningful moment came when a group of international peacekeepers visited the museum. They stood before him, representatives from different countries and cultures, and each offered their own military salute. No words were spoken, but the message was clear: dignity speaks a universal language. The incident had shown that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred isn't a shout but a silence, not a reaction but a stance. The Guardsman's quiet dignity had taught more about strength than any loud voice ever could. His simple act of standing firm had created a ripple effect that continued to touch lives in ways no one could have predicted. As time passed, the story became part of the museum's own history. Tour guides would point out the spot where it happened, not to remember the hatred, but to celebrate the dignity that overcame it. And there, day after day, the Guardsman continued his duty, standing as a living reminder that true strength often speaks without saying a word.